What is up, guys? Welcome to the N1 Fitness Podcast. I'm your host, Marcus Sadu, and today we've got Robb Wolf back on the show. Robb is one of my favorite people in the fitness industry. I've learned so much from him, so I'm stoked to have him on the pod talking about autoimmune disease. So we dig into things like how does dis-ease develop, where to start with an autoimmune condition as far as, nutrition, lifestyle, sleep, movement, all that good stuff. Why some folks get certain conditions and not others, the link between autoimmune disease and things like depression, anxiety, brain fog, cognitive impairment, some often overlooked advantages of autoimmune conditions, as strange as that sounds, how Robb manages his autoimmune condition. He has celiac disease. We also dig into sun exposure, tanning beds, cancer, should you wear sunscreen, and then we close out the episode on just how to live a healthful life in general. So enjoy this episode with Robb Wolf. Robb, great to have you back on, my man. Thanks for doing this.
Huge honor. I will bring down property values anywhere people will let me do it. So thank you.
Thanks for coming on. So how did autoimmunity and autoimmune conditions originally come on your radar? Like, what got you interested in this aspect of health specifically?
Oh man, that's a good question. And it was really my struggles and then my mom first. Like, she had been sick. I mean, as long as I could remember, she had all kinds of GI problems and just a really, not infrequently, she was referred to a psychiatrist, and that, the doctor went, well, I think it's all in your head because it's like, this hurts and that doesn't work. And it was this kind of miasma of problems. And I remember one of the first things that kind of turned the corner for her was finding a candida diet approach, which was basically kind of a low carb, and it eliminated this, that, and the other. And she made some really significant improvements with that, at least initially. But it was probably 5-10 years after that we got a diagnosis of celiac, which is an autoimmune, a condition, a strong genetic predisposition for reactivity to the gliadin protein in gluten, wheat, rye, oats, barley, millet. And it's worth mentioning that for not all autoimmune conditions, I don't think, but for many of them, it's interesting when you look at their genetics and the kind of the life history, the evolutionary biology of them, they usually confer an advantage in a different situation. So people with celiac disease have an advantage in fighting off gastrointestinal parasites and bacteria and whatnot. So it's thought to be one of the more prevalent Northern European adaptations to civilization, to living in not hunter-gatherer groups, but, farms and eventually cities and whatnot. And there was a much higher infectious disease load. And not infrequently, a number of autoimmune conditions, you find that people have a very robust autoimmune response. And so I know that that's not answering the initial question, but it's frustrating to me that many conditions that we face today are likely due to an evolutionary mismatch. And only the negative side is mentioned, and nobody bothers to mention the positive side, that people with autoimmune conditions generally are less likely to develop cancer. That's not always the case. There's some exceptions to it, but there are some kind of benefits there. Some of the downsides is that autoimmune prone people oftentimes also develop more cardiovascular disease. So I think it's just worth mentioning at the outset that it's not a 100% negative scenario. And that's been some of the fascinating stuff that I've discovered working through all this stuff over time. But when we discovered my mom had first celiac disease and then lupus, Sjogren's, just like about 8 different interrelated autoimmune conditions. And then for myself, I had what appeared to be the early stages of rheumatoid arthritis. And I definitely also had ulcerative colitis, and I have celiac. And so this was around 1998 that I discovered all this stuff. And Lauren Cordain's early paper, Cereal Grains, Humanity's Double-Edged Sword, really kind of cracked all this stuff open for me. It was talking about how lots of different plants have anti-predation chemicals in them that can be immunogenic. They can stimulate the immune system in different ways and can be very, very negative, can be precipitators to autoimmune conditions. And an interesting kind of side note along that is once you get past cancer, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, autoimmune disease is a massive morbidity, mortality burden. And even in that cardiovascular disease spot, like I kind of alluded earlier, I'm now looking at cardiovascular disease almost as an autoimmune condition. It's like an autoimmune condition of the vascular endothelium and whatnot. People forget that cholesterol and lipoproteins play a really important role in the innate immune response, and that is part of what's going on there, and also the enhanced vascular inflammation that some folks experience. So I know that was a super long, wandering answer to a very concise question, but it was definitely personal interest, and then my mom's situation, and I think I really burrowed into it because if I was able to catch a person's ear who had some type of GI problem or autoimmune condition, and I could get them moving in any type of a ancestral way of eating, typically their health improved just to a jaw-dropping degree. Like, it was really amazing. And still within standard medical circles, like, you have very poor outcomes for autoimmune conditions, and really a very limited bag of treatment options. They have immunosuppressant drugs, and there's a little bit of gene therapy that's kind of on the horizon, but things generally don't go well for people. The treatments are kind of gnarly themselves. Immunosuppressant drugs have a really high cost benefit profile because you could get sick, the flu, COVID, cancer, like all these other things become much more problematic in an immunosuppressed individual. So I think it was almost kind of it was definitely a personal interest, but also it was like having some really good leverage. I knew that if I could catch folks' ear and just get them like, hey, if you try this for 30 days, it could change your life. And that's not a really big ask of people. And it can end up being really a huge benefit to them. Yeah.
That's really cool, man. Now, you touched on cardiovascular disease as potentially being autoimmune in nature. And instead of listing, all of the things that are autoimmune conditions, I feel like it would be easier to go about it in the opposite way, in the sense that, do you think that anything that pops up health-wise for people is actually not autoimmune in nature to begin with, or at least has an immune root to some degree or another?
That's a really good question. And I mean, this is where it gets a little bit murky. And like, I tend to be a lumper anyway. Like, I like to lump everything together. I'm not much of a splitter. In science, there's kind of lumpers and splitters. And at the end of the day, virtually everything is falling under this broad term of systemic inflammation. And inflammation is mediated by the immune system. So it could be a little bit of a slippery slope, because then it's kind of like, okay, everything's inflammation, so how do we deal with that? But I think it's actually really insightful, and this is some of the kind of frustrating challenge here. Like, you go to a gastroenterologist if you have ulcerative colitis or Crohn's or something like that, and the gastroenterologist really focuses on your gut and your poo and everything that's going on, and in my opinion, not a super effective way. And they don't ask you any questions about how you're thinking and what your brain function is. And then you go but if you do manage to get a referral, then you go to the neurologist, and the neurologist is scanning you for, beta amyloid proteins, and, do we have early Alzheimer's and all this type of stuff. And they never ask the question, well, how's your poo and how's your gut? And I've been fiddling with this article for literally the better part of 10 years. It's basically like the end of medical specialties, because we now, it's almost certain that, say, like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's appear to possibly be precipitated by changes in the gut microbiota and a loss of intestinal barrier function that then leads into some sort of systemic inflammatory response, possibly a legitimate autoimmune response. And maybe defining this stuff a little bit better, like an autoimmune response is when your body makes antibodies to different proteins in our system. And we want a process like this when we're dealing with infectious disease. We don't want so much of this process when we're dealing with things like allergies or autoimmunity, but it's kind of where our body is interacting over the course of a lifetime with millions of different molecules and proteins. And it has to figure out what is self and what is not self. And if it's not self, how concerning is that? Like, do we need to mount this really potent response to it, or is it kind of benign? And you could make the case that the immune system does as much information processing or more than our brain does. It does it in a different way, but it needs to identify the structure of these things, kind of collate it against a list of all the kind of known things that are part of our body and are acceptable. And this is where it gets difficult. The different plant proteins in particular have epitopes of their structure. If you think about like Lego being stacked up, like if we had a 6 amino acid sequence that could be part of a plant protein, but it also looks like the protein in like the tear ducts of our eyes, and you get an autoimmune response to that plant protein, now you might end up with Sjogren's because your body mounts an autoimmune response to that. So there's the innate immune response, which is not adaptive, and then we have the secondary or adaptive immune response, which is where kind of the autoimmune stuff goes. And it's maybe worth mentioning it again. I know I'm bouncing all over the place here, but historically they've really looked at like allergy and autoimmunity as very separate things because of the different, classes of the immune system that responds to it. What we're finding is that a lot of stuff kind of exists in this weird middle ground, like mast cell activation syndrome and whatnot. It's not really allergy, it's not really autoimmune, but it generally heightens the immune response across the board because there's something that's going on that the body's not digging. And so it generally kind of ramps up the kind of like civil response within the body, for lack of a better term. And diet, lifestyle, intestinal barrier dysfunction, sleep patterns, all these things seem to be coming together in kind of a perfect storm to irritate all of this system. And I think that this is where it's easy for doctors to just kind of dismiss this stuff, is that it can affect anything and everything: our cognition, our energy levels, sexual reproduction, ability to gain muscle mass or recover from physical activity, depression. I mean, on and on and on. All of this stuff is mediated at some point with these processes. So it gets. This is where I think that the reductionist approach to medicine kind of runs up against a brick wall, because when you start trying to go one thing after another to address it, it's kind of a game of whack-a-mole. You go after one thing and another problem pops up. And I do think that this is the benefit of kind of an ancestral health or like holistic medical approach, where we try to take everything into consideration: the total allostatic load, the stress, the gut microbiota, possible immunogenic foods. And we start factoring all that in and just kind of tinkering and experimenting, usually some sort of an elimination diet, and looking at general lifestyle, specifically sleep and stress levels, seem to be kind of a very common first intervention to start getting some beneficial forward progress on this stuff.
So is that where you tend to start then, is you start with the diet and then move forward kind of sleep, movement, light exposure, sleep, stuff like that? Do you move forward from that place?
Yeah, and I try to get all of those going at the same time, which is no small ask of many folks. But it's funny, over the course of time, I've actually shifted my focus to anything that benefits your sleep is the thing that you need to be doing for overall health. And this is true whether you're like an Olympic caliber athlete or somebody trying to recover from an autoimmune condition. And what's fascinating about that is you do get some pushback on the sleep topic, particularly from like the type A, corporate exec, where they're like, "Oh, I'll sleep when I'm dead," or whatever. And it's like, well, you can pull out some really cool studies where people that are even mildly sleep deprived, they are as cognitively impaired as somebody who has like a blood alcohol level of 0.1. Like they're impaired enough that they shouldn't be driving. And so you make this case that like, well, if you want to go out and kick ass and take heads in the corporate environment, like, you should be sleeping more, and here's kind of some support for that. And then people okay, they'll kind of warm up to that. And then when you start looking at things like heart rate variability scores and a few things like that, and their sleep sucks, it's like, well, you're having a lot of blood sugar wackiness, so we need to tighten that up. So we're probably going to have to reduce your carbohydrate level. So coming at the diet secondary to sleep has been interesting because it's like, dude, it's your body. Like if your body would just deal with carbs better, then I'm cool, but it doesn't. So we need to do this, and maybe when we get everything else going, you'll handle this stuff better. So that's been an interesting angle. I definitely like to tackle the sleep, the movement, community, gut health. But if you can couch it in something that's kind of non-triggering, like sleep, then it kind of offloads that reactivity to it. And it's interesting, even the pushback that people provide, they're like, well, isn't eating more protein bad or whatnot? It's like, dude, you're sleeping better. Let's just sort that out first. And then, it's been a really interesting process. I wish I had thought about orienting it more around sleep 10 or 15 years ago instead of really beating the dietary drum first.
So is that sort of like a lowest hanging fruit approach first? Because it's like, I find that the nutrition, like with autoimmunity, you just can't seem to get around it. Like you could, in sort of an alternative universe, it's like, if you could get your sleep on track when your diet is still shit, which you probably can't, but if you could, you still have to address the diet. You know what I mean? So that seems to be that linchpin because of all this stuff with the gut and the immune system and all of that. So it's like, it's a tricky one. It's a tricky one to get as far as implementation goes and practically speaking in everyday people's lives,
Yeah, it is, but I think you hit a really good point there, which is it's just a sneaky way of getting that emphasis on there. It's like you have to fix this, like it's non-negotiable. There's so much good research around poor autoimmune outcomes in like shift workers and sleep deprivation, and even precipitating events being, like really traumatic scenarios where people have powerfully disordered sleep, like you see it in like triathletes and some people coming back from war and stuff like that, where they'll end up for a variety of reasons with highly disordered sleep and then develop a full-blown autoimmune condition. And so it's still, causation is still a little bit murky there, but there's definitely some really tight correlation. And at a minimum, we find that the severity of autoimmune conditions seem to track really strongly with poor sleep. Like shift work is one of these just prime examples. Like the healthcare workers that are doing night shift, the nurse that has MS and they remain on night shift duty, like it just destroys them. Like it's really a terrible thing. There's far less data currently showing that unwinding all of those poor diet and lifestyle situations that we find ourselves in are as beneficial. But like Terry Walls, I think she has eight or nine, clinical trials now showing dietary and lifestyle intervention showing significant benefit for a variety of autoimmune conditions. Yeah.
Very cool. Now, do you think that we're all sort of born with a specific autoimmune condition propensity? So for example, maybe some folks are more likely to experience arthritis and then others more prone to diabetes, another group of people more susceptible to like Hashimoto's or eczema or whatever. Like, do you think that why do certain people get certain conditions and other people get other conditions? Is it genetic? What do you think is going on there?
It's a really good question again. And I, without a doubt, there's some strong genetic predisposition in these situations. So like celiac again, there are certain genes that are associated with up to like a 300% increase in the likelihood of developing celiac disease. But there are people who don't have those genetics, but they get exposed to something like Giardia or C. difficile, which are these really gnarly gut pathogens. And they didn't have the genetic predisposition, but they had an epigenetic change due to a really nasty gut infection that precipitates a celiac disease. So so this is where I think somebody said, I forget who it was, that genetics loads the gun and then the environment pulls the trigger. But that can go both ways. People can develop, so like Hashimoto's, again, there are certain polymorphisms that are definitely much more highly linked with that condition, but there are people without those genetics that go on to develop Hashimoto's, and usually there's some sort of an environmental epigenetic switch that gets flipped that brings them to that state. Yeah.
Okay, got it. Now, you sort of touched on this before, but looking at tying in autoimmunity to things like depression and anxiety, I find that really, really fascinating. I'm kind of been thinking about it lately, just noticing it in myself as well as my clients. Like, eating starts to go off the rails, and then, feelings of depression, anxiousness, whatever, increase. And chances are sleep and, things like alcohol intake are sort of mixed in there. So it's tricky to really parse out. But like, how are you viewing that right now?
Just as far as like kind of the mental emotional state as it relates to autoimmune disease?
Exactly. Like maybe some inflammatory stuff going on in the brain.
For sure.
What's up there?
I think probably gut inflammation, systemic inflammation. And again, this is, it's maybe getting trite to even say that because it seems like everybody has some degree of this stuff, but it also is a little bit insightful that less developed areas, and it doesn't need to be eating a paleo diet, but just eating a less westernized diet, not having so much exposure to say like evening light, like all the kind of comforts of a cushy Western existence, which is great in many regards, but may have some downside effects also. Kids that are raised in environments where there's minimal evening light exposure, like you just don't find the same amounts of depression and autoimmune disease and whatnot. But then this is again where it gets interesting. And like I have this 4 pillars of health that I put together for my second book, Wired to Eat. It's sleep, food, community, and then movement. And it's interesting if you're living in an environment like that, like a more pre-industrial type environment or more traditional environment, you typically have friends and family in this extended social network. And we already know that that's like this huge factor in happiness, depression, longevity. Like there's this linkage between inadequate social connectivity being as deleterious to lifespan as a pack-a-day smoking habit. So that's where this stuff does start getting kind of difficult to detangle. And it's just kind of, well, we need all of it. We need community. We need good food. Electrical lighting is great, but it can have some downsides, like putting some dimmer switches in your house, putting on some blue blockers in the evening. Those things could potentially go a long ways towards mitigating developing this stuff or even managing the severity of it if you have it. And there's some pushback around that, but it's also one of these things where I'm kind of like, there doesn't appear to be a huge downside to installing a $50 dimmer switch in your bedroom and like dialing the lights down at night and stuff like that. Like I guess if you bump your head and have a traumatic brain injury and die, then you know that's a problem. But I think that's pretty low likelihood in this scenario. So I do like the cautionary principle of whenever you do an intervention, being aware of unintended consequences. But it's like joining a gym, going to jujitsu, developing community, donating your time in a way that makes you feel good and you have community around you. We don't have perfect randomized controlled trials on this, but it really seems to benefit folks when they do these things, when they tick all those boxes of sleep, better food, community, appropriate movement, and all of that happens in a really synergistic way. So this is, again, where I think the reductionist medical approach is fascinating and it's really powerful, but it also has its limitations. Like, how do you then, if you cut the mouse into its constituent parts, how do you put it all back together, and same deal with a human being.
Yeah, totally. And I wanted to circle back around to what you said about celiac, the tie between celiac and being more likely to fight off something like a parasite. And we tend to focus on the negative impacts of the gluten intolerance or the celiac stuff, but not necessarily the evolutionary benefit of being able to fight off parasites. Now, is that because of like increased likelihood of transit time? Like, what do you think's going on there that, a lot of people get the flushing effect from eating foods that they don't tolerate very well. In the case of celiac, you have some gluten and you got to run to the toilet kind of thing. Like,
Right.
what do you think's at play?
Definitely. I mean, that increased transit time is actually an angle I haven't thought about, or decreased transit time, like dumping things. I mean, hot foods do that. You eat a really spicy meal and it tends to move things along. What I understand of this currently is, for sure, there's just the immune system is a little bit more on edge. Like, it will tend to ramp up a little faster, have a little bit more of a maybe not catastrophic, but a very frisky response to a gut pathogen. Like, it tends to mobilize a little bit quicker and more vigorously around that. And it makes sense from the perspective that if you were living in an environment where your water sources could be tainted, you're just around more people, and there's more potential for the transmission from human to human, but also animal to human, and then from there, then it makes sense that could have been an evolutionary advantage. This is one of my frustrations. Like, when people look at the BRCA1 gene family for like breast cancer and whatnot, nobody mentions that those women in particular, but men can have the BRCA1 gene also. They tend to be more fertile. They tend to have fewer health problems earlier in life. Like, there's all these other kind of benefits, and you don't have to go that far into our near history. The BRCA1 wasn't as correlated to breast cancer as what it is now. Like, I think there are environmental triggers that are firing that, but it's only been more the last 20 or 30 years that this divergence from our diet and lifestyle is so profound that this thing that was of a benefit is now potentially a hindrance. And this is even in more advanced stage. There's this term, I'm blanking on part of it, but pleiotropy, which makes the argument that you could have an advantage early in life, that a genetic setup that then later in life is deleterious. The one thing that I would push back on that, though, is that humans are really powerfully selected for a long life. There's this thing called the grandmother hypothesis, which is just basically that the complexity of human culture and the energy requirements of raising human children really lend itself to multi-generational families, because these grandparents who are potentially post-reproductive age store the wisdom, can monitor the kids, can help them, protect them, all the rest of this stuff. And so I get some of the position around, people will say, well, this thing may have been beneficial in youth and not so great later on, but I still think that there's a weighting towards just an environmental mismatch, because we have this overarching theme that humans are really powerfully selected for kind of abnormally long lifetimes relative to our size. Most primates are kind of oriented this way. Elephants are oriented this way. More intelligent organisms that have a complex social network tend to be disproportionately selected for longer lifetimes. And there's part of that is that you have these members of that community that are maybe post-reproductive. They're not going to have more babies, but they can sure help with the current crop of babies and like adolescents and whatnot, imparting that wisdom and just kind of monitoring and protecting them. So I do think that these genetic predispositions are important to look at. They can help inform what we should be doing from a diet and lifestyle perspective, even more so. But it's still, like, we still just kind of need to do that regardless of what your genetic deck of cards are, because this circles back again where not everybody who develops breast cancer has the BRCA1 gene, as an example. So I mean, it's these predispositions they're a probability. They're not a certainty generally. Yeah.
Yeah. And I like that too, because it sort of puts the ball in our court, right? It's like, okay, well, I might have a specific genetic propensity to something, but if I know that if I eat better, I move adequately, I sleep well, get community, that I'm going to be less likely for that to happen no matter what, right? So it just sort of, I like I'm with you that I like taking that approach because it's the only power that you have. Like, what are you going to do with your genetic makeup?
Right. And I had a person reach out to me recently and they were pretty cranky with me. They're like, I've been following your stuff for like 10 years, been eating paleo, and I still managed to develop rheumatoid arthritis, and so kind of like, fuck you. What is the thing? And I pinged this person back. I'm like, hey, one, I'm really sorry to hear that. But two, in your initial communication, you mentioned that you had basically peridiabetes before, and now you don't. And all I would throw out there is that how much worse would your situation be if you were fully diabetic and RA? Like, we know that that's a worse outcome and your situation would be worse. And, we're doing is just trying to risk mitigate across all this. And the person actually came back and like, I'm really sorry. That was kind of a prick move, and you're right, because I when I think about how bad I felt without autoimmune disease, but peri-diabetic, and overlay both of those, it'd be like, kind of a death sentence type thing. So it is worth mentioning, none of these interventions are a guarantee. I may keel over tomorrow from a heart attack or something. And the challenge that I face is even if I have like super high cardiovascular risk potential with the way that I'm eating and living, I don't know what else I would do at this point. Like I've kind of like whittled down. Like I do know that I seem to feel best with what I'm doing, and too much of a deviation one way or the other. Like if it decreased my cardiovascular disease risk by 10 or 20%, I think it would decrease my life quality by like 30 to 50%. So I don't even know what I would do at this point. We're all gonna die from something, but as it stands right now, I've been able to, given the genetic and epigenetic bag that I've inherited and developed over my lifetime, feel like I'm doing the best job I can with it. And that's about all that we could do. And like developing some fatal disease would suck without a doubt. I would like to see my kids grow and maybe meet some grandkids and all that type of stuff. But I do feel like that it's important to remember that diet and lifestyle isn't 100% fix for any or all of this stuff. But shitty diet and lifestyle will always make the situation worse, like without a doubt. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And you have celiac, correct?
I do. Yeah.
So how have you gone about this? I think that'd be super helpful for folks. Like, you have an autoimmune condition that you're dealing with, and you've done an amazing job of, I don't know how you'd position it, put it into remission or whatever, put it on the back burner at least, so it's not running your life. But how have you done that?
I mean, it's easy in that I just need to avoid gluten. Now, that gets not so easy because like we just moved to Montana and we found a super cool little restaurant that we like to go to. And for breakfast, I order a couple of hamburgers with like a little bit of grilled veggies on it and everything. And somewhere in that mix, they're getting me. Like, I don't know if the hamburgers are grilled on the same grill that they toast the buns. I don't know if they're using the same spatula that they flip the buns over, that they flip my hamburgers over. But the 2 times that I've eaten there, I had shockingly decreased transit time immediately after the meal, and I've eaten other places and not experienced that. I eat at home and I don't experience that. It is cool in that an exposure like that 10 or 15 years ago would have left me feeling horrible for a week. And now it's kind of like an afternoon. So like my health has improved. My severity of reaction to a gluten exposure has absolutely improved. I don't pressure test that. Like, I don't go out having beer or sourdough bread or anything like that. But when I get these exposures, then it's not as bad. So there is hope even there. And I don't know if it's improvement to my gut microbiota or my vitamin D levels are higher, so the immune response isn't so powerful. I'm not sure what it is because I've done all these different things to try to get there, but it's definitely improved. But again, mine is kind of easy because I just kind of have to avoid that environmental trigger. And then I'm pretty good to go. If somebody had rheumatoid arthritis or multiple sclerosis or something, like, so some folks do put that in remission, and it may be via some diet and lifestyle modification. Like not infrequently, they find that gluten is kind of a trigger in that scenario. For other people, it's corn. For other people, it's dairy. So they may find a really powerful dietary linkage and like, man, so long as I don't have dairy, my joints don't hurt and I'm good to go. But for some folks, it's just, they have to tick all the boxes. Their sleep has to be really on point. They can exercise, but they can't dig too deep of a hole, or their recovery isn't going to be adequate to kind of, motor them through. So mine's honestly been easy in that I'm okay with complying with the gluten deal. Like the only things that I miss are beer and sourdough bread. Like nothing else really, spins my propellers that much. But like I loved dark beer before, like loved it. And I've tried every gluten-free beer out there and it's just not the same.
It's not.
It's it's like internet porn versus sleeping with like you're the hottest person you can think of. It's just like it's not it. Yeah.
So do you think that you've sort of, by eating healthfully for years, taking care of sleep, movement, all that good stuff, that you've created a bit more of a buffer when you do get a gluten exposure, that if you were to reintroduce gluten, for example, on a regular basis, that it would crush you maybe for a little bit longer versus just an afternoon kind of thing?
Yeah, I've created a buffer for sure. And the things that I know are better, my general digestive process is better. And interestingly, I eat almost carnivore. Like I've found that, and man, I didn't want to end up there. I'm not like the guy that's like, everybody go carnivore, but I've slowly just kind of slid that way. I do okay with fruit. Like I do reasonably well with some fruits, some vegetables, but like a green salad is not my friend. Like it just doesn't go well. My wife does a dressing that is apple cider vinegar. It's equal parts of olive oil, apple cider vinegar, a little bit of garlic, and then a ton of salt. I mean, like a mountain of salt in it. And I'll put that on the salad and mix it up and put it in the refrigerator and let it cook for a couple hours. Like the acid breaks it down. I'll do okay with that. But if I get just like a freshly made salad and I hammer it down, like I will get kind of loose stools and that kind of rapid transit time. Like my gut's not really happy with that. But my gut health has improved. I know when I first was figuring out all of this stuff, I was living in Seattle. I'd been in a graduate program for a long time. I had my vitamin D tested then, and I think it was 12. Like it was so low. And oh man, it's hard to get lower than that. You can, but it's really rough. But the past couple of years, I've been using like a spurty vitamin D lamp. I get out in the sun whenever I can, and I use this app called D-Minder. So I stay out as long as I can to optimize vitamin D, but not, it's basically like, okay, you're done. Now you're just causing more skin damage relative to the amount of vitamin D you get. So I don't really get much of a tan off of it, a little bit, but very, very little. And then I supplement with vitamin D3, K2, and vitamin A, just from some dropper forms. And I recently had my vitamin D checked and it was 84. And like that, and we know that vitamin D plays a huge role in modulating the immune response. There's a latitude-based tendency for people to develop more autoimmune diseases the further they get away from the equator. And it seems to likely be vitamin D driven, or at least light exposure driven. Like that's a piece of it. So I've plugged a lot of holes in that regard. I get the UV radiation vitamin D from either the spurty lamp or being out in the sun, and I do it at a very modest level. I supplement orally with some vitamin D3, K2, and vitamin A because all of those work really synergistically. And then over the course of time, I've really figured out, I've eliminated the bulk of the foods that just don't sit well with me from a GI perspective. And I think all of that has bought me much more buffer if and when I do get those occasional kind of gluten exposures, where used to I would get like kind of neurological response. I would have really disordered sleep for a while. And I mean, it was a pretty big deal. Whereas now I feel pretty bad for an afternoon. I don't want to be too much further than shuffling distance from a bathroom. But then once 5-6 hours goes by, I'm back to like 85, 90%. The next day, I'm pretty good to go. I think if I had serial exposures day after day for about 3 days, I would be pretty messed up. But fortunately, I've been able to avoid that.
Got it. Now, I personally use when I'm in Vancouver and it's still the winter time. I'm fortunate enough that I bounce around a fair bit travel wise and get some sun in the winter time here. But when I am in Vancouver, I will go do a tanning booth. I'll do, 5-6 minutes. My skin is, a little bit darker. I'm half Indian, but I've noticed that you have done the same. I don't know if you're doing it now, but I just look at it like it makes me feel better. I think it's better for myself personally than not getting any sun exposure, but there's so much sort of negative connotation around, tanning in general. So can you parse that out for us?
Yeah, and I'll be honest. When you look at the research on tanning, it's scary. Like it's just like increases skin cancer rates. Like there's all the stuff, and it mainly focuses on tanning booths. But I've really dug into this, and part of this is because I feel so much better doing a tanning booth that I'm like,
Same.
fuck, I really don't want to be killing myself here. So folks listening, take it with a grain of salt. Like I really desperately want some confirmation bias on this. Like I'm looking for confirmation bias here. I'm fishing for it.
And I'll say too, just on my end, like I think part of the feel better thing for me is I like the way I look with a little bit more of a tan too. Like that's factoring in too. It's like, it is what it is, but
this is one of the interesting things when we get exposed to some UV light, part of the corticosteroid cascade of producing vitamin D, there's all these different avenues that are activated. Our beta endorphins are ramped up. You feel better. Like you're like, hi diddly ho, neighbor. Like you just feel better. It was hilarious living in Seattle where these people who are from that area, they're like, oh, the lack of sun doesn't bother me. And it was the days that the sun would come out, like everybody was just springing their step. And I'm like, you guys are so full of shit. Like you don't even realize how low functioning you are most of the time. But on the research stuff around the year 2000 2001, there was a fascinating review article written that made the case that although some amount of sun exposure increases skin cancer risk very marginally, but even that has to be taken with an interesting grain of salt. Lifeguards, construction workers, people who spend their lives outdoors, who get the most sun exposure, have the lowest skin cancer rates. So there's there's even something fishy there. And what seems to be really problematic is the pasty, pale office worker that goes to Cabo, lays in the sun, falls asleep from like 6 margaritas, gets scorched. And then what's interesting, so the skin damage is bad, but this is something that's really interesting. If they then retreat indoors, don't get subsequent sun exposure, that is worse. And this is what appears to be going on here is some sort of epigenetic tuning that basically the sun exposure tells your skin cells, you need to do this, you need to do that, maybe some apoptosis here, that's skin cell is becoming weird, so we need to get rid of that one. Whereas when you remove the sun exposure entirely, it seems to become senescent. It doesn't quite know what it's doing. And this seems to be this really weird track into higher rates of skin cancer. And it is so nonlinear and kind of counterintuitive. It's like, well, just more sun exposure should be bad. So if I get burned, I shouldn't have more sun exposure. It's like, no, you shouldn't go back out and get burned. But actually the risk profile decreases with like very, minimalistic UV light exposure. And so like getting light or UV from the sun is kind of this one chunk of the story. And then when we start unpacking the tanning booth piece, there are some of these booths that are like the high pressure, mainly UVA, which mainly produces the tan piece. UVB is what produces more of the vitamin D piece. And these are the more expensive tanning booths that you only stay in for like 5 minutes. They have like a 5-minute max or something like that. And then usually in the back of the facility, they have like the kind of disused, kind of look down upon low pressure UVA, UVB bulbs. And those things, folks will build up a tolerance to stay in there as long as 20 minutes. And to your point, I think that going in for like somewhere, and ramp up, like you go 3 days a week, 4 days a week, and you start off at 2 minutes, and then you go to 3 minutes, and then you go to 4 minutes, and you figure out your own skin type. But you figure out that if you could stay in there 15 minutes before really tanning, then stay in for 7 and just hover between that 6 and 7 range. What is really interesting in the tanning booth research, and I haven't looked at it in about a year, but I mean, I was following it for a long time. I have this giant folder on this stuff. And up until about a year ago, the research on this was use or not use of tanning booths. And that was it. And so if we were to look at smoking versus non-smoking, period, like that's an important question to ask. But what do they always ask? How many packs a day do you smoke? And a 2-pack a day smoker is way different than somebody who has a cigarette when they're out drinking with friends once a month or something like that. Technically, they're still a smoker. Technically, there's still some sort of a risk profile associated with that, but it's totally different than the pack a day smoker. And what's 99% of people, 99.9% of people who use tanning booths use it to get a tan. And they usually go for kind of almost the shoe leather type tan versus just kind of like a little base level deal there. So I think that, and again, I may be twisting and conflating this stuff 10 ways from Sunday to support the fact that I feel better. And so I'm trying to just psychologically convince myself that there's something okay here. But this is an interesting facet of this. Like they're not, the studies that I've looked at up until about a year ago, they do not consider dose at all. How long are people staying in there? What type of tanning booth? It's basically, it's binary. It's use or not use. And we do know that the vast majority of people who use a tanning booth use it to tan versus use it trying to find a minimum effective dose to just feel better and get a little bit of that vitamin D boost.
Yeah, and I don't think this is really surprising because so many things in biology work off of that U-shaped curve, and nobody knows that better than you do when it comes to, you were on the podcast talking about salt a while back, and that's the same sort of deal. So it's not like all or nothing, you don't want to go for that leather handbag look, but you also don't want 0 sun exposure. And I think, you touched on the person going to Cabo and getting super red and overdoing it or whatever. And I think for folks to think about, if you go for one really, really, really hard workout twice a year, you are going to be no better off than if you had scaled up appropriately and, consistently exposed yourself to that and ramped up or found a happy medium or whatever. That's not hard to grasp. And it's the same thing with sun exposure.
Yeah. I just can't wrap my head around that the source of all life on our planet is this thing just conspiring to kill us, And again, I understand that there's trade-offs with everything. So too much or, the wrong pattern of exposure and whatnot, the fact that we work indoors so much is a major hindrance. It's really hard to overcome that. It's a cloudy day today, but the sun has been out intermittently in Kalispell where I live. And even though it's quite far north, I could get some vitamin D if I was out there. And even absent that, I would be getting a much more intense light exposure to entrain my circadian rhythm. But between homeschooling the kids and doing the work I've got to do, I'm not going to get outside until 1 o'clock. And that is super not optimal, and so there's all those things, but because my life isn't optimal doesn't mean the sun is trying to kill me, and that biology has set it up that this thing that provides either directly or indirectly, literally all energy for the totality of the planet, and evolution hasn't prepared me to deal with that. It's kind of like that seems squirrely. Now, my current lifestyle, because of the way I live, sets me up so that I have to be much more mindful of that because I'm not out morning to night as we shift at the equinox towards ever longer days. And I slowly habituate to that, that's an entirely different story. And even, gosh, I know this again, bouncing around and kind of out in the weeds, but more equatorially living hunter-gatherers really avoid noontime daylight. They just kind of disappear into the underbrush and generally will avoid it because it's very fatiguing, and they can and will get sunburned under certain circumstances. So even those circumstances in pre-industrialized societies, people weren't out in the sun all day, but they were generally outside, and their sun exposure was going to be kind of intermittent and kind of fractal in nature. And I think that makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
So then where does sunscreen fit in for you then? Like, do you throw some sunscreen on your kids kind of thing, or like, does it fit in? How do you approach that?
It really doesn't, other than like if we go to Mexico or the Bahamas or something like that, where there's really significant sun exposure. We will let the kids get a first, like, particularly like the first couple of days, it's like 15 minutes. And then we do a hat and long sleeve clothes. And then we will do a little bit of the zinc-based sunscreen on their face, back of their legs, because the kids will build sandcastles and stuff. And like we kind of screwed that up, and they got a little bit of a burn when we went to Costa Rica because we didn't. So we will put some kind of zinc-based stuff on the back of their legs, but each day we let the exposure run a little bit longer. Fortunately, Nikki's Italian, so like, and both kids kind of got her skin a little bit, and I'm 10% Native American. Like, I actually tan up pretty well once I get kind of ramped up to it. So both kids will tan up pretty well, but we just kind of stretch out the exposure a little bit. We use more clothing as the main protection, and then we'll go with 100% block out, like the zinc, instead of some of these like paraben based stuff that seem to have some dodgy potential health side effects to them. Yeah.
Love it, man. Now,
which makes us like Satan incarnate. Like any pediatrician that listens to this are gonna be like, dude, CPS needs to take those kids before the next round of summer,
Right. Now, I asked you a whole bunch of sort of random questions, whatever came up post autoimmunity stuff. So we bounced around, but is there anything that you'd sort of want to leave folks with that we didn't get to on this autoimmunity, vitamin D, lifestyle, sleep, movement, all this stuff sort of topic?
Man, that's a good question. I think maybe just appreciating that the details of all this stuff are way more complex than I think anybody realizes. Like 10 years ago, I thought I had cardiovascular disease totally figured out, and I just feel dumber and dumber every day that goes by. I just have more and more questions, and the more I dig into it, like the more ambiguous some elements of it get. But even though the details are really opaque, at least to me, maybe smarter people can figure this stuff out. But I think the what to do is reasonably simple. We get kind of a protein-centric diet. We figure out whether we run better on carbs or fat or kind of a mix. We try to get those mainly from whole food sources. Try to get outside as much as you can, have meaningful social interactions. Challenge yourself, like pick new things to do. I just got my brown belt in jiu-jitsu and just ever more in love with that. I'm trying to pick up guitar again, and hopefully Nikki will start teaching me some Italian here. Like, I just want to tinker with that language stuff, but just the challenge, a little bit of challenge, a little bit of new stuff, and then just ticking the boxes of some real basics. That if we're playing darts, that's maybe not a bullseye every time, but damn, it's close. Like, and it's comparatively little effort to get there. And then depending on how complex an individual's situation is, we may need to get very granular to get to that next step, like autoimmune paleo or specific carbohydrate diet or carnivore or something, or some other diet or lifestyle intervention. But for the vast majority of people, that's going to get them very far. So even though there's a ton of detail, a ton of nuance, generally, if we just start with these big picture heuristics, that will get us most of the way there. And a little bit of tinkering and shuffling will help to get each one of us to our sweet spot.
Couldn't agree more, man. Now, where can folks find you online, the pod, LMNT, all that good stuff?
Yeah, I'm writing a lot for Elemental Labs for Element, and that's at drinkelement.com. I'm really not online much anymore. Like our podcast is kind of it. I have social media profiles, but I have an assistant that posts them on there. Like the toxicity of those spots just got the better of me finally after like 20 years of being online. And right now I've really pumped the brakes on that. So I'm still trying to provide some value there. But if folks want to talk to me, it's basically like your podcast, our podcast, which is called The Healthy Rebellion, or we have a community called The Healthy Rebellion. And if you just search for that, then you can track that down.
I would highly recommend the podcast. I listen to it every single week. I think I've listened to every episode for like a decade. It's crazy. I look back. Yeah, man. Yeah. So I'll link to all that stuff in the show notes. And thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. It was super fun. Thank you.
I hope you guys enjoyed that conversation as much as I did. Now, if you're interested in personalized one-on-one nutritional coaching and or workout design with me, you can head on over to n1fitness.com/coaching or just click the link in the description below. Follow me up on Instagram at N1Fitness and feel free to friend me on Facebook at Marcus Sadu. And lastly, be sure to hit subscribe on whatever platform you're listening on. Thanks so much for tuning in, and I will catch you on the next episode. See ya.